1,000 years ago, a medieval farmer cracked open an egg and unknowingly consumed one of the most complete superfoods in human history. An egg created not by factories, not by chemicals, not by profit-driven systems, but by sunlight, soil, insects, seasons, and time. And that single egg carried natural vitamin D from real sunlight, balanced omega-3 fats, powerful antioxidants, complete amino acids, and life-building nutrients that strengthened bones, sharpened minds, fueled hard labor, healed the sick, supported pregnancy, and sustained entire civilizations without supplements, pills, or doctors. Yet today we eat eggs more often than ever before and still suffer from fatigue, inflammation, hormonal imbalance, gut problems, obesity, and chronic disease, which forces us to ask an uncomfortable question no one wants to answer. If eggs are still eggs, why did they once build powerful humans but now seem to contribute to sickness? And the answer lies not in the egg itself, but in what we did to it. Because medieval chickens lived freely under the sun, ate worms, grass, seeds, and insects, followed natural day-night cycles, laid fewer eggs with far greater nutritional density, while modern chickens are confined to cages, deprived of sunlight, forced under artificial lighting, fed GMO corn and soy, pushed to lay over 300 eggs a year, turning a living animal into a production machine. And when life is treated like machinery, nourishment disappears even if the shape remains the same, which is why modern eggs look identical but contain lower vitamin D, imbalanced omega-6 fats that drive inflammation, weaker yolks, and reduced micronutrients, and why modern science unfairly blames eggs for cholesterol and heart disease, while ignoring the true culprits of sugar, refined flour, industrial oils, ultra-processed food, and sedentary living, because eggs never caused disease. When eaten in a natural system, they only became problematic when removed from nature and forced into an industrial pipeline, meaning the egg did not fail humanity, humanity failed the egg. And the deeper truth is that this story is not really about food at all, but about what happens when humans disconnect from natural systems, replace soil with factories, sunlight with fluorescent bulbs, quality with quantity, and wisdom with labels like farm fresh and cage free, which often mean nothing. And perhaps real progress is not found in newer technology or louder marketing, but in remembering what medieval people understood intuitively, that food raised by nature nourishes the body, while food manufactured by systems slowly breaks it down, because the egg was once a symbol of life, strength, and renewal, and it can be again, but only if we stop asking how cheap it is and start asking how it was made. And when we continue this forgotten story to its logical end, we realize that the modern egg debate was never meant to protect our health, but to protect an industrial system that cannot survive truth, because admitting that medieval-style eggs were superior would force us to admit that scale destroyed nutrition, that speed killed quality, and that convenience came at the cost of human vitality, which is why we are taught to fear cholesterol instead of inflammation, to count calories instead of nutrients, and to blame ancient foods instead of modern processing. Even though for thousands of years humans thrived on eggs, animal fats, fermented foods, and seasonal diets without epidemic disease, and the real danger today is not eating eggs, but eating disconnectedly, mindlessly, without knowing where food comes from or how it was raised. Because when chickens never touch soil, their eggs lack minerals. When they never see sunlight, their yolks lose vitamin D. When they are fed unnatural diets, their fats become inflammatory. And when production replaces patience, the egg becomes an imitation of itself, which explains why two eggs that look identical can produce completely different effects in the human body, one strengthening immunity and hormones, the other quietly fueling inflammation and fatigue. And this is why returning to fewer but real eggs, pasture-raised, sunlight-fed, naturally laid, cooked gently in stable fats and eaten with whole foods, can restore what was lost. Because the human body still recognizes ancient nutrition, even if modern society has forgotten it. And perhaps the most dangerous myth of all is that progress only moves forward, when in reality the healthiest step we can take may be backward, toward older wisdom, slower systems, and food that comes from life rather than factories. Because the medieval egg was not a miracle, it was simply honest food, and honest food does not make humans sick, dishonest systems do. And when this truth is fully understood, it becomes clear that modern society did not accidentally ruin the egg but systematically redesigned it to serve speed, profit, and scale rather than nourishment. Because a medieval farmer valued survival, strength, and continuity, while modern systems value output, uniformity, and quarterly numbers. And this shift quietly altered not just eggs but the human body itself, since food is not neutral, and every nutrient carries instructions that speak directly to our hormones, our immune system, our metabolism, and even our behavior. Which means when we consume eggs stripped of their natural balance, we are not just eating weaker food, but sending distorted signals to our biology, confusing systems that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to recognize sunlight-derived fats, mineral-rich yolks, and seasonally produced nourishment. And this confusion manifests slowly first as fatigue, brain fog, unstable energy, mood swings, and cravings, long before it becomes disease, which is why modern illness feels mysterious and disconnected while medieval health was intuitive and visible, because people could directly observe the relationship between land, animal, and body. Whereas today, food arrives wrapped in plastic with its history erased, and eggs are sold as identical commodities rather than living outcomes of a process. Yet biology does not care about branding or labels, it only responds to reality. And reality is that an egg laid by a stressed, confined, artificially lit chicken cannot carry the same biological intelligence as one laid by an animal living in rhythm with nature. And this is why two people can eat the same breakfast on paper, but experience completely different health outcomes, because nutrition is not just about macros, but about context, origin, and integrity. And once this is understood, it becomes obvious why medieval people could eat eggs daily without fear, while modern consumers are warned to limit them, count them, or replace them with artificial substitutes, which is not progress, but evidence of a broken system attempting to compensate for its own failures. And the tragedy is that instead of fixing how food is produced, we attempt to medicate the consequences, prescribing pills for cholesterol, hormones for imbalance, and supplements to replace nutrients that were once naturally abundant, creating an endless loop where the solution generates new problems, all while the original answer sits quietly in history, ignored because it cannot be patented or mass-produced. And this is why returning to the principles behind medieval eggs does not mean rejecting modern life, but correcting its excesses. Because sunlight is still sunlight, soil is still soil, and the human body has not fundamentally changed, meaning the path to better health is not hidden in futuristic inventions, but in restoring basic biological contracts between animals, land, and people. And when those contracts are honored, food regains its power to heal rather than harm, making the egg once again what it was always meant to be, a symbol not of controversy but of life itself. Because once we accept that food carries intelligence, memory, and biological instructions, we are forced to confront a much larger realization that the decline of the egg mirrors the decline of many traditional foods that once anchored human health, from milk to bread to meat, all of which were transformed from living, seasonal nourishment into standardized industrial products, and in doing so lost the subtle complexity that the human body depends on for balance, resilience, and repair. Which explains why modern nutrition feels like a constant battle of counting, restricting, supplementing, and correcting, rather than a natural state of strength and stability. Because when food is real, the body regulates itself effortlessly. Hunger signals are clear, energy is steady, and health is maintained without obsession. But when food is artificial, the body enters a state of constant negotiation, craving nutrients it cannot find, over-consuming calories without satisfaction, and slowly accumulating damage that only becomes visible years later. And eggs sit at the center of this contradiction, marketed as both a health food and a health risk, praised for protein yet blamed for cholesterol, recommended one decade and demonized the next. Not because the science is confused, but because the food itself has been altered so dramatically that it no longer behaves consistently in the body. And this inconsistency exposes the flaw in modern nutritional thinking, which tries to isolate single variables like cholesterol or fat while ignoring the ecosystem in which food exists. Because medieval people did not analyze eggs, they experienced them. They saw strength in those who ate well, resilience in winters survived, fertility in growing families, and recovery in the sick who regained vitality. And those observations were not anecdotes, but data gathered over generations, encoded into cultural wisdom, seasonal eating habits, and respect for how animals were raised. Wisdom that was later dismissed as unscientific precisely because it could not be reduced to spreadsheets or controlled environments. Yet the human body itself is not a laboratory, but a living system shaped by evolution. And when we feed it food raised in alignment with that evolution, it responds with health, while when we feed it food engineered for efficiency, it responds with stress, inflammation, and imbalance. And this is why modern eggs so often feel heavy, inflammatory, or irritating to people who otherwise tolerate traditional foods, because the issue is not intolerance, but incompatibility, a mismatch between ancient biology and modern production. And recognizing this shifts the question from should we eat eggs to what kind of eggs should exist at all? A question that challenges the foundations of industrial agriculture, because producing truly nourishing eggs requires space, sunlight, biodiversity, time, and restraint. All things that reduce profit margins but increase human well-being. And this is the silent conflict underlying modern food debates. A conflict between systems designed to maximize output and bodies designed to thrive on quality. And as long as that conflict remains unresolved, we will continue blaming foods that once sustained us, instead of the systems that degraded them. Yet history quietly offers an alternative, showing us that when humans work with nature rather than against it, even the simplest foods become powerful. And perhaps the most radical idea in modern nutrition is not a new diet or breakthrough study, but the humility to admit that our ancestors were not lucky, they were aligned, and alignment with natural processes created foods that nourished without controversy. Which means the path forward does not require reinventing the egg, but restoring the conditions that once allowed it to be whole, alive, and worthy of the role it played for thousands of years in building strong bodies, clear minds, and resilient societies. And until we do that, the debate around eggs will continue to confuse, divide, and distract, while the deeper truth remains unchanged, that health is not manufactured, it is grown, slowly, patiently, under the sun. Under the sun, in soil that is alive rather than sterilized, within systems that respect limits instead of exploiting them, because limits are not obstacles to health, but the very structure that makes health possible. And medieval societies understood this intuitively, even without scientific language, knowing that animals pushed beyond their natural rhythms produced weaker offspring and weaker food, while animals allowed to live according to their nature produced nourishment that strengthened the people who depended on them. And this understanding shaped not only how eggs were produced, but how they were valued, eaten, and respected, which is why eggs were rarely wasted, rarely overconsumed, and rarely separated from the rest of a whole diet, eaten alongside fermented foods, seasonal vegetables, whole grains, and animal fats that work together to support digestion and absorption, creating a nutritional harmony that modern diets struggle to replicate despite endless supplements and fortified products, because nutrients do not act alone. And an egg's power was never isolated in protein or fat, but in its relationship to everything else on the plate and everything else in the environment, a relationship that modern food systems deliberately break in the name of convenience, separating nutrients from context, animals from land, consumers from producers, and in doing so creating confusion where there was once clarity, forcing people to rely on experts, labels, and marketing to tell them what their bodies once knew instinctively, yet instincts cannot be fooled forever. And this is why so many people feel a quiet sense that something is wrong with modern food even if they cannot articulate it. A sense that eating has become complicated, stressful, and morally loaded instead of nourishing and grounding. And eggs often become the focal point of this anxiety because they sit at the intersection of tradition and modernity, symbolizing both ancestral nourishment and industrial manipulation. And when people feel conflicted about eggs, they are often responding not to the food itself, but to the invisible history behind it. A history of confinement, acceleration, and control that contrasts sharply with the simplicity advertised on the carton. And this disconnect erodes trust, not just in food, but in the systems that produce it, leading to a cycle of skepticism, dietary swings, and health confusion that benefits industries selling solutions rather than answers, while the real answer remains inconveniently simple, that food raised in alignment with natural processes nourishes without debate, and food raised in opposition to them creates problems that no amount of nutritional messaging can fully solve. And accepting this truth requires a shift in perspective from asking what foods are good or bad to asking what systems deserve to exist, because a society that prioritizes speed over substance will always struggle with health, no matter how advanced its medicine becomes. And eggs are merely a visible example of a much larger pattern, one that reveals how deeply production methods shape biological outcomes, reminding us that we cannot engineer our way out of problems created by ignoring biology, only realign with it. And this realignment does not demand perfection or a return to medieval life, but a conscious choice to favor quality over quantity, connection over convenience, and nourishment over output. Choices that may seem small on an individual level, yet collectively determine the health of entire populations. Because when millions of people eat food that quietly undermines their biology, the result is not immediate collapse, but slow normalization of sickness, fatigue, and dependence on medical intervention, making poor health feel inevitable rather than preventable. And this normalization is perhaps the greatest tragedy of modern nutrition, because it lowers expectations of what the human body is capable of when properly nourished. Expectations that medieval people would have found strangely pessimistic, having witnessed firsthand the strength, endurance, and resilience that emerge naturally when food comes from living systems. And remembering this challenges us not to romanticize the past, but to question the assumptions of the present, to ask whether technological progress has always meant biological progress, or whether in some cases it has simply distanced us from the conditions that allowed health to flourish. And in that questioning lies the potential to transform not just how we view eggs, but how we define progress itself. Recognizing that true advancement may not be measured by how much we can produce, but by how well what we produce sustains life. Because the ultimate purpose of food is not profit, convenience, or abundance, but the quiet, consistent support of human vitality, a purpose the medieval egg fulfilled effortlessly, and the modern egg can only reclaim if we are willing to change the system that shapes it.